Hello, and welcome to another video lecture for Mr. Moser's 8th grade U.S. History class. This is a video lecture titled Working Conditions, Workers in America, 1900s. This is a lecture video from our Industrial Revolution unit. We've been looking at the rise of big business, the change in the production of products from going from handmade to mass-produced in factories and the assembly line. Now we're going to look and see kind of how that has an impact on some of the working conditions for Americans in the 1900s. So here we go. The textbook readings comes to us from two sections in the textbook, pages 642 to 645, the growth of cities, and then city life, pages 646 to 649. The guiding questions are, what is urbanization? How did urbanization change the American city? Why did so many members of the family have to work during the industrial age? What were the challenges of living in tenements in the major cities during this time period? So let's talk here first about urbanization. If you break down the word urban, urban means city life, and urbanization is this growth of the cities during this time period. When America first founded itself in the late 1700s, we were a farming rural society. People owned small farms, they were agricultural-based societies. But during the 1800s, we begin to see urbanization. More and more people are moving into the cities to find work, to find jobs. And as we talked about as one of the factors of industrialization, this increase of population where these people are now settling in the cities. Cities specifically like New York here in yellow and Chicago here in red are just busting at the seams. Because there is so much growth in these cities, they are becoming very, very crowded, and the space is rather limited. They need to build up and vertical. And this is where Carnegie and the steel becomes so important in the industrial age, because the large skyscrapers, these tall, high-rise buildings, are going to be made from steel. That's what has the strength to hold these very, very tall buildings. There are two videos we watched in class that I would definitely encourage you to take a look at, and that is The Buildings That Touch the Sky, that looks at kind of the rise of the American skyscraper in America's cities, especially cities like New York, which are so rapidly growing. And of course, we watched this YouTube video in class as well, the Watch the New York Skyline Change, which is kind of a neat little video that shows the rises of the buildings throughout the 1800s and even into the 1900s, where we get these even bigger skyscrapers today in the 2000s. So it's a really neat video that I definitely would encourage you to watch. So what were some of the problems for these workers living mostly now in these larger cities where the factories were located? Well, one of the biggest problems was low pay. Factory workers were not paid really all that much. There was not a need to, because there's so many workers demanding jobs that factory owners could really lower their wages. Women typically worked anywhere between $1 to $3 a day. They had to pay for their own tools, and unlike today, where you go on the job and have on-the-job training and you're actually paid while you're being trained, in this time period, there's no on-the-job training. If you're there and you're just being trained, you're not getting paid. You probably would learn pretty quickly in that case. Children also worked even as young as 6 years of age in many of these places and factories. They typically worked for $1 to $3 a week. So we're talking a lot lower salary because they were smaller people, which is how they were viewed, and so they got paid less. Kids worked in all factors of society. They worked in mines, coal mines, iron ore mines. They worked in factories. They worked in textile mills. And like a lot of workers, they worked from dawn till dusk. You put in about a 12 to 14-hour day in most cases on the job. The mills and factories where the workers worked were very, very hot, not very great places to work in. They were hot in the summer, very cold in the winter. They didn't have central heating and cooling like we kind of take for advantage today. Accidents were very, very common. Safety was really not a big concern for the factory owners. We're going to talk about an incident later on called the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory Fire, which kind of illustrates this point. But it was pretty common for people to lose limbs, lose fingers, be killed on the job, and they could get replaced. And this is really before there was any kind of regulations in place that kind of protected the workers' safety. And if you got hurt on the job, there was no safety net. You were kind of on your own and relied on the charity of others, or like a lot of immigrants, as we talked about, relied heavily on those benevolent societies to help workers who got injured on the job, to help still pay for things like rent and food. Many of the tall buildings didn't have fire escapes or fire sprinklers, as we're going to talk about later on as we get into the the Triangle Shirtwaist Factory fire. The working conditions were also just horrific in the fact that a lot of the places where you worked were nearby your home. So a lot of these mills and factories and mines, the little towns will spring up around them. If they were outside of a major city, they would basically build a small town around the factory, around the mine. And as you worked, oftentimes the only place to buy your goods, your clothing, your food was at the local company or factory store. And that was oftentimes owned by the factory owner or a family member of the factory owner. And so not only were you not paid very much, but oftentimes you had to buy things that really were expensive for you and your family. You couldn't go to a different store because if it was found out that you shopped someplace else, you could possibly lose your job. And so a lot of people were kind of forced to buy from the company store, and it was not always the best prices. You didn't have that freedom to choose what you wanted to buy. Many of the apartments that workers will live in, as we discussed with our immigration unit, will live in these buildings called tenements. They were very cheap apartment buildings. They were very crowded. You might have anywhere between 10 to 18 people living on the floor that you're living on in your apartment. They didn't really have running water and heat initially. That will improve on as we get into the 1900s, but definitely in the late 1800s, there's not a lot of heat. No sewer services. People dump their garbage, even human waste, excrement, yuck, into the streets and alleys surrounding by these tenements. So there was this nasty aroma and smell in and around these buildings. A lot of the interior rooms didn't have windows for fresh air, so it was a good thing if you were in an outside room, because at least you could get some fresh air if you were in the alley where they dumped their garbage and human waste. We watched a video in class that looks at the sanitation problems of the major cities, which were definitely problematic in these very poor working neighborhoods where a lot of immigrants lived, but also where a lot of workers lived as well in these cities. So it was hard to be a worker in the industrial age. You got paid very little. The whole family had to work. Even your small children oftentimes end up working at a very young age. And of course, you're living in some pretty horrible places like tenements that are not very clean, sanitary. A lot of diseases were pretty common. It was pretty hard for young children to get out of there alive. What we call infant mortality rate was very, very high in a lot of these places, which are going to spur some changes as we'll get into here in the coming lectures. But it was not necessarily a great place to live if you were a poor worker in some of these major cities. So hope you enjoyed listening and watching about the working conditions in America in the 1900s. As always, if you have questions, please come see me.